I would like to welcome all of you to RC lesson number 3, and today we will be discussing how to manage bad answer choices. When the choices aren't good, how do I possibly eliminate all 5 of them, and then revisit them and end up picking the right one even when I don't like it. It's something you've seen me guys do to some extent on most of my other curriculum here, but today we'll be diving into it just a little bit more deeply. So a review of what we'll be going over. First off, for me there are 2 primary reasons to eliminate an answer choice in RC. The first such reason is that the answer contains a stretch. It doesn't quite say exactly what we want, but I could see how it might work if we really pushed hard to do so. The second reason is that the answer seems irrelevant. I'm not sure actually if it fits that logical standard, but to me it seems irrelevant, and what I mean by that is that it isn't what the author, passage, or selection really seem to care about. And that could be based on me misunderstanding something, or more likely me simply not reading something just because I skipped the vast majority of stuff in a passage. But either way, the important thing is I have judged it to seem irrelevant because I don't have any basis outside of the answer just not feeling consistent with what little I did actually read. And as you might have heard, these things that I've been talking about, I haven't really been describing them as objective standards. And that's something that I want to call your attention to here. It's very, very important for the rest of this lesson. Stretch and seems irrelevant, I'm not using those as objective standards. Again, they are not objective standards. Answer choice explanations commonly pretend like stretch and irrelevant are objective, but here I'm here to tell you that it's not. So don't fall for that sort of rubric or breakdown that the explanations tend to give you. If it's a stretch to you, then it's a stretch. If you didn't think anyone cared about it, then that's what you think. So here's kind of the weird part. Today's lesson is not about making you change that view, not making you think, oh, this is no longer a stretch, or oh, this actually is relevant. I am not here to try to change your mind on that. I'm here to teach you how to manage that view. So without changing your views, how do you manage the views that you have in a manner that gets you to a correct response? So more specifically, we'll talk about how to make each determination in terms of stretch versus irrelevant versus just plain old wrong, and most crucially, how to deal with times when either one of the stretch or irrelevant answers might still be a correct answer. Again, that's the whole crux of this. It's not to change your mind about what you think is a stretch or what you think is irrelevant. That's not the goal here. The goal is to have you keep that, but still at the same time give you a chance to still get the question right. And it's possible. I all the time do this. I pick an answer that I just know is a stretch. It's not that I think it's a stretch, I just know it's a stretch. But I still am able to pick it as the correct answer because I have the management tools that I'm going to try my best to impart to you today. And to do that, I'll be looking at Prep Test 60, Section 4, questions 13 through 20. I believe that is passage 3. I consider that the whole passage I didn't like, but there are 2 particular questions on that I think demonstrate what I'm trying to talk about the best. So because this is going to be long enough, I'm just going to dive right into it. Here's the passage. It's about Chicano theater. We're going to start right up with paragraph 1. So first sentence, someone named Cesar Chavez unionized Mexican-American farm workers in California back in the 60s, and that's widely seen as the beginning of the Chicano political activism, whatever that is. Pretty straightforward. It's just some straight facts. And now the last sentence, Valdez, I have no clue who Valdez is. He's just totally out of nowhere, clearly not Chavez. And the members of the resulting Teatro Campesino, another thing I have no clue about, are widely seen as starting the Chicano theater movement, which is yet another thing I have no clue about. So this last sentence just introduces like 4 new things that are just brand new. So given how lost I felt, I guess I should try some predictions. In terms of predicting what I skipped in paragraph 1, probably some link between Chicano political activism and Chicano theater. It seems possible that theater stuff was somehow used to advance the political goals of activism. That seems to be a typical thing of theater, but that's just me guessing based on logic, not anything specific to reading comp. So in terms of predicting where the rest of the passage is going, I'm going to guess that it's probably going to give us more on the theater aspect of this relationship. So again, paragraph 1, we start off by hearing about Chavez starting the political activist movement, and then Valdez, by the last sentence, kind of basically creating Teatro Campesino and starting the Chicano theater movement. And so given that it started with political activism and then kind of progressed to the theater movement by the time it got to the end, that to me, in my experience, is generally a sign that they're going to stick with whatever they ended up at, which is the theater artsy part. Sure, there might be some connections made again back to political activism, but experience tells me that it's going to be more about arts than politics. Of course, I could be wrong, but this is just what I'm thinking at the time. So onward to paragraph 2. So our first sentence here, in the fall of 65, Valdez gathered a group of striking farm workers and talked to them about conditions. Again, more facts. The last sentence, we are introduced to something called actos. Again, WTF for those? I have no clue. They just came out of nowhere. They are based on participants' personal experiences and they have palpable immediacy. A phrase like palpable immediacy is pretty colorful for the LSAT to include in a passage, so chances are there's going to be some sort of why did the author use this or what does the author mean by this kind of question, so that's just one thing I'm picking up as I read that last sentence there. So predictions. In terms of what I skipped in paragraph 2, I predict that some explanation of what octos are is what I skipped. As far as I can guess, they're probably some sort of play or dramatic work within the wider context of Chicano theater, written or played by farm workers themselves. That's my guess based on the whole last sentence, participants' personal experiences, palpable immediacy, that sort of thing. So my guess is that they're going to be more grassroots, ground-up kind of thing, because not only is that what the last sentence says of this paragraph, but also that sort of thing is something that the LSAC loves to put in any sort of art/politics kind of passage. Based on this, where do I think the rest of the passage is going? Honestly, when I was reading it, I had no clue. I hate this passage. That's all I was thinking. I really didn't. So with all that hate boiling in my mind, right at paragraph 3. So starting right up with our first sentence. So we are introduced to somebody named Yolanda. I don't even know how to say that first hyphenated name. Broilus? I should look that up, but I don't care. But the last name I can't say, Gonzalez. Who the hell is she? Again, this is like the first sentence that I read, and this is the third one that introduces somebody brand new. So apparently Gonzalez wrote a book that rightly, according to our author, rightly criticizes theater historians for pretending like Valdez is solely responsible for coming up with octos. As if the farm workers' improvisation, it seems like I was kind of right about what octos were, wasn't a big part of it too. So it does seem, this sentence does confirm that octos are sort of a grounds up kind of the people who are consuming it are also the ones kind of making it. It's not really some hoity-toity artist making it and then sort of sprinkling it down on the masses. It's actually kind of a participatory thing, it seems. Alright, unpacking the last sentence now. So what we see here, and it seems to be our author speaking, not Gonzalez, the early development of Teatro Campesino was in fact a collective accomplishment. But nonetheless, Valdez was still a really important player. And then we begin to hear more of that last sentence after some punctuation about Campos. Again, this is another WTF moment. This is something that I have heard nothing about in any of the other little bits of scraps of reading that I've done, no indication of it, but here we go, they drop another brand new term on us, Campos. So now for predictions. I'm going to start with predicting what I skipped in paragraph 3. I probably skipped some explanation of what Campos are. As far as I can guess from the way it's presented in the very end of the last sentence, Campos are probably some sort of precursor to octos, but I have no clue what else they are aside from that. As for predicting where the rest of the passage is going, I don't care because we finally reached the end of this mess. I literally am not going to predict anything else in terms of what this ending indicates that I may have missed. What I will do though is an overall review of the passage. Paragraph 1, it establishes a link somehow between Chicano theater, Valdez, and Chicano political activism, Chavez. Paragraph 2 introduces us to octos, which I'm guessing is a type of play or dramatic work within Chicano theater where the farm workers improvise or act out what actually happened to them on some level. Paragraph 3 introduces Gonzalez, who is a writer who thinks historians are mistaken to give Valdez pretty much all the credit for inventing octos as a genre or a thing. The farm workers who made and performed the octos were just as big a part of making them. It also happens that our author kind of pipes up here in paragraph 3, and it appears the author clearly agrees with Gonzalez that it was a collective effort instead of just being Valdez. But the author here does bring up something called Campos to argue that octos are not just copies of Campos or European theater, and this somehow means that we should still give Valdez a lot of credit for developing or helping develop octos, in some part at least. I hate this passage so much that I'm going to waste the whole slide talking about it, but truth be told, there is some objective things that I would like you to notice about how this was set up. So almost everything that I read so little, but almost everything that I read introduced a new person or an idea. I consider this a hallmark of poor writing and lack of focus. That's just my opinion, of course, but compared to other RC passages, I don't think I've been whiplashed this hard by a passage in quite some time. Again, obviously sentences are going to talk about new things because the discussion progresses. But to have a new name, a new concept, another new name, new concept of book, like this is hitting us with a lot of new stuff in a short space of time. I mean, at a closer reading, maybe I could be wrong about this passage. Maybe it is more typical than I think, but I don't care because I don't remember anyways. I never remember an RC passage, so I do mercifully not have to care. So let's hit the first question that I think demonstrates the process a little bit. Question number 18. So this one is asking us about what the author and Gonzalez had the same attitude about. So starting right up with answer choice A. The influences that shaped Carpus as a dramatic genre, did the author and Gonzalez have the same attitude about that? And to me, in my limited recollection of the passage, because I read so little of it, this feels irrelevant. They don't really seem to care very much about this particular subject of the influences of how Carpus got there. We care about how Octos got to be what they are. But Carpus, I don't remember any real discussion of that. Then again, I didn't read anything, but still, I didn't get any indications of it in anything that I did read. When it comes right down to it, I should probably research this, but I hate this passage so much, I'm just going to refuse to do it unless I'm forced to later on. So because of that, I'm just going to eliminate this one for now. Moving on to B, the motives of theater historians in exaggerating the originality of Valdez. This just feels completely inaccurate to me, right on its face. I mean, at best, it would be a pretty big stretch. When it comes to the exaggeration, I think both of them would agree that Valdez's role has been exaggerated in formulating and turning Octos into what they were. But I mean, motives? I don't think they cared about why this exaggeration happened, just merely they would agree that it did happen. Also, originality seems like a big stretch here. The thing being exaggerated was how important Valdez was in creating Octos, not how original he was as an artist. So I feel pretty good about eliminating this one right on its face. Moving on to C, the significance of Karpas for the development of the genre of the octo. And while it doesn't sound quite as bad as A or B did to me, this one does look like a stretch to me as well. So the reasons why I thought so are as follows. The last sentence of paragraph 3 does establish a link between Karpas and Octos, but honestly, I really don't know if the author cares to discuss the significance of Karpas to Octos beyond there being merely a connection of some kind. So for me, what I honestly did was I eliminated it. Yeah, sure, it didn't look quite as bad as A or B, but I thought C was stretchy in its own right. And now onto choice D, the extent of Valdez's acquaintance with Karpas as a dramatic form. This one just seems factually inaccurate. I don't think either person, either the author or Gonzalez, really had anything to say about this issue. I mean, both Gonzalez and our author probably talked directly about the fact that farm workers were familiar with Karpas. I feel like that's probably something that is going to be an outgrowth, because if farm workers were involved with Octos, my guess is that they may have been in some way, shape, or form involved, or at least an audience for Karpas as well. But I don't recall seeing anything about Valdez actually knowing or caring about Karpas. And again, my whole thing about workers being familiar with Karpas is also something of a guess. I feel like maybe my eyes passed over something about Karpas being done in the region that a lot of these workers were from. But again, that's kind of a guess on my part, a hunch, so I'm not sure. Somebody knew about them, that's why it had to matter. But I don't think either the author or Gonzalez really emphasized that Valdez knew or cared about Karpas. So again, while I could be wrong, I do feel pretty good about eliminating this one just simply on the basis of this seems to be barking up the wrong tree. I don't think either of our author or Gonzalez really cared about this issue at all, about how familiar Valdez in particular was. So that brings us to E, which I am a little bit worried anytime I eliminate A through D. I always worry that if I eliminate E just as confidently, I will be stuck doing it all over again, but that's just a reality that I'm used to. And so when I'm doing this on my own, actually, I do move rapidly, especially in situations where I eliminate all 5. It's boom, 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 boom. I make very quick eliminations. So despite my worries, let's look at E, the role of European tradition in shaping Valdez's contribution to the development of Octos. This feels irrelevant, a lot like D was irrelevant, actually. So the last sentence of paragraph 3 did tell us that the Octos are different from both Campos, which was kind of what was brought up in answer choice D, and European tradition, which is being invoked here in answer choice E. But Octos still has a connection to both of those things. But really, that's it. Based on what little I read, we have no clue how much or in what fashion either Campos or European tradition impacted Valdez's work with Octos. So I will eliminate this one as well, and that puts us in a position where we killed all 5 of them, so we do have to revisit the thing, starting with answer choice A. So starting right up at the top. Taking a closer look at A, I think I'm going to eliminate it again based on this. Researching this from paragraph 3, that's where I remember hearing about Karpas. And I see that we hear where it comes from, though like the region, but no discussion from the author on what shaped Karpas into what they were, and arguably no real discussion of it from Gonzalez either. B also similarly messes up its second chance. It seems really wrong after reading a bit of paragraph 3 at this point. Yeah, just nothing about motives as to why these historians would have exaggerated Valdez's role. C, I think I'm going to have to uneliminate this one. Hopefully it'll be the only one that survives the second pass. There's at least a chance that this one might work. Gonzalez does talk about Octos coming from Karpas in some sense, in the stuff that we just reread for answer choice A. And the author does agree that Octos at least has a connection to Karpas. it might be possible to say that the significance of Karpas to Actos is merely that they have a connection. I mean, it's not comfortable. I mean, it's not comfortable to me. I feel like that's not the best way to put anything. If you say something, if you think something has significance, express the significance. Technically, yes, just having a mere connection and nothing beyond that is a level of significance, but that's just not the way I would express it personally. So I think it's a stretch to me personally. That's what the language is. I think it's a stretch. But it's a stretch that nonetheless can be made. I don't see a similar stretch point for either A or B so far, so in that light, C does get uneliminated because it's stretch and it's within bounds, within reason to an extent. And I'm recalling that D and E are both sort of easy eliminations, but looking at D again, yeah, it's still wrong. I don't think anybody cared about how well Valdez knew Karpas. And again, I reread paragraph 3 a little bit to, at least the latter half of it, to research answer choice A, and there was nothing about how well Valdez actually knew Karpas. I think the presumption is that he was familiar, given that he worked with, supposedly at the end, Karpas and European tradition, but Actos was still something entirely separate from those two things, or distinct from those two things. So, there's an implication that he knew, but again, there was no discussion of it, so D is there's really no support for D. And mercifully, E also seems to mess up its second chance. The same as D, only this time instead of about how well Valdez knew Karpas, it's about how much he cared about the European tradition. But same error, different words. So we are stuck selecting C, even though I personally still, to this very moment, believe that it is not the most defensible answer choice. And I'm sticking to it. I still don't like C very much. I want to emphasize here, it's entirely possible that you have no problem with C. Let's say you did this on your own, or you kind of paused the video and did it on your own and came back here to check. It's entirely possible that you really have no problem with C, and that's fine. Remember, the whole point of today is to talk about places where you personally feel when you read something that you didn't like it, that you didn't believe it, you didn't think it was going to be the right answer, whatever it was, you had a problem with it, and the answer choice explanations you're reading are pretending like you shouldn't have had a problem with it, if it was the correct answer, and learning how to deal with that. So the best way to model that is taking something that I legitimately still, personally, even though I could be objectively incorrect, I subjectively don't like C because it doesn't meet my language standards that I like to use for this exam. Again, it's okay if you don't, but that's if you don't have that same problem. But that's the whole point of this, so just stick with me for a second. So again, I just want to emphasize, this whole discussion is about when you don't like something. And what you can do is adapt the approach that I'm about to talk about here, or the one that you've seen demonstrated. You can use that approach to reassess an answer that you passed up earlier. That's the whole sort of goal of this thing. So when it comes to answer choice C, for me, I logically understand, if I really think about it, that if I ask somebody, what is the significance of X to Y? A valid answer can be simply, X is just connected to Y, nothing more. I understand how that works on a logical level. But for whatever reason on RC, or maybe because it's RC, I was immediately suspicious of relating the word or the concept of mere connection with the word significance. Again, I get that, I understand how the English language works. I get that mere connection is a level of significance. I just believe that RC very often makes different word choices rather than this one. Or maybe they do it all the time to be trick answer choices. Who really knows? But either way, my flags went up, my red flags went up. I just didn't like it. I still don't like it. That being said, despite this dislike, I also managed to re-eliminate everything else on a second pass, and gave myself room to acknowledge that maybe I was being paranoid and that I can allow significance into a conversation that was originally about mere connection. So that's what I wanted you to observe, is that I didn't like it, I still don't like it, but as I was assessing things, I could find a stretch point that wasn't too unreasonable for C. I could find that. I gave myself the room to look for a stretch point there. But I just couldn't find similar stretch points for A, B, D, and E. In fact, D and E were just factually inaccurate. They were trading on, I would think, distorting the passage's ending discussion about the role of Karpas and European tradition in formulating Actos. So I think they were just flat out wrong there. But A and B, I was looking for something that could have been, stretch points, but I really didn't see anything. C, I still didn't like it, but I could recognize at least that there was something stretchy there. I could have done it if I really wanted to. And that previous point is really what I want you to take away from this. You don't have to change your mind about something that you don't like. I thought C was a stretch at the beginning. I still think it's a stretch, but I'm able to recognize on second pass that it's a stretch that the exam may recognize as a correct answer. There's a difference there. You don't have to force yourself to just brainwash yourself and drink the Kool-Aid and accept that the right answer is right for some reason. To me, to this day, I still don't like this answer. And because I forget, maybe it's because of PTSD and I just hate reading comp, I'm going to forget about this. And the next time I see it, I'm going to have the exact same feeling of hate. I'm going to relive this horrible moment over and over again like some terrible Greek myth. But that's what it is. I never really feel the need to brainwash myself and accept what somebody else is saying if that's not how I see it. The whole goal is, okay, fine, I see it this way. Is there any way for me to still keep my perspective, be stubborn like I am, and still come up with a way to get the right answer? And this is the best I can do for you guys. You can still retain that high standard of, I don't like this because it's a stretch. But if you maintain a high enough standard, nothing, especially if the answer that you eliminated was the right answer, nothing else should meet the bar. So you should eliminate everything. And on second pass, you should be able to see, okay, I do have a high bar. I understand that this isn't cool, but if they really, really wanted to, they probably could have done this. Like having that little bit of extra wiggle room, being like, okay, I know this is not exactly what I was looking for. But if I really, really wanted to, I could erroneously you can even put it that way in your head, erroneously stretch this term to meet this other term that the answer choice is using. If you can do that, you can give answer choices a second chance when they are decent enough. But still, the other four shouldn't really survive analysis. That's usually not the case. So let's try this same torture again on a second question, question 20. This one is another sort of inferential one. The passage most strongly supports the following. So before we do the actual question, just to note, this might not be a particularly difficult question for most of you, but remember that I've done almost no reading. In case you forgot, I hate this passage. I have almost no grasp of the details that would support various inferences. Even the little stuff that I read in paragraph 3 to answer question 18 is hard to remember. My brain is already losing its grip on it, frankly. At least, even now, especially now that I'm recording, because it's been even more time. But even as I was doing it, by the time I moved from question 18 to 20, my brain was already trying to rid itself of what I picked up in paragraph 3. But because of all this, because of my minimal reading, and the little reading I did do is starting to leave my brain, I feel like my question 20 experience here will be a decent simulation of how to move efficiently through answer choices when you're missing a key detail or several key details. So one question and one sort of dilemma that I get a lot is, when it comes to inference questions, a lot of times students tell me, if I just managed to read this very small buried detail. Yeah, that's true. If you had just managed to pick that small buried detail up, you would have been able to answer the inference question correctly. That does happen a lot. That being said, we can't pretend like you're never going to miss a detail ever again. And so me kind of intentionally not reading details, because that's just the way I read these things, I think sets up a decent simulation of, okay, what do I do when I missed that detail that would have just given me this answer choice immediately? How do I do it? You can have an even worse position demonstration in my part, because without exception, each and every one of you watching this probably has a stronger grasp of almost every single passage than I do, because you actually read them. I never do. So me with this position of having just about nothing in hand when I start a question, you will be infinitely better off than I am. And so just look at what I do and try to adapt wherever you have gaps. Maybe there's something you can do to move forward when you're just missing that one detail and you don't even know where it is. Watch how I do it when I don't have the details. So starting right up with A here. A talks about the Karpus tradition has been widely discussed and analyzed by both US and Mexican theater historians concerned with theatrical performance styles and methods. Immediately widely discussed seems like a huge stretch to me. Karpus only came up at the end during Gonzalez's and the author's discussion about how significant Valdez was in creating actos. I have no recollection of how widely they were discussed by other people, though. That wasn't something that I saw featured. And also, A includes this weird thing about US and Mexican theater historians, and I really don't remember if they made that distinction at all. So at this point, I'm going to eliminate A. So moving right along to part B here. So B talks about comedy being a prominent feature of Chicano theater in the 60s. My honest reaction when I was doing this, comedy, WTF, it feels completely out of left field. I recall almost nothing about this. I think in one of the sentences that I did read, there was mention that Karpas were satirical. Maybe it wasn't even the first or last sentence. I think it may have been the reread that I did for answer choice A and question 18. But I do remember seeing that somewhere. But to extend from that, in my memory, what was a passing reference, extending from that to comedy was a big part of Chicano theater seems like a massive stretch. Absolutely massive. So at this point, I eliminate B. So pushing right into C here. Oops, I kind of lost my place. In directing the actos of the Teatro Campesino, Valdez went to great lengths to simulate or recreate certain aspects of what audience had experienced in the Carpas. So another pretty massive stretch here, went to great lengths. I mean, I remember from, again, the rereading that I did from paragraph 3 for the sake of answering question 18, I remember that a Carpas is certainly connected to actos in some way, but I don't recall a single scrap that would indicate that Valdez cared so much about, recreating Carpas with an actor. So not only do I not remember anything about the recreation of Carpas, I don't remember that he cared about it that much at all. So great lengths, it's a double stretch. I really don't like this. So pretty happily, I'm going to eliminate C at this point. Moving along to D, many of the earliest actos were based on scripts composed by Valdez, which the farm worker actors modified to suit their own diverse aesthetic and pragmatic interests. I mean, I really have no clue on this one. It doesn't sound right to me based on what I've read from paragraph 3. I mean, I personally have no actual clue how actos were actually composed, but from what I gather from paragraph 3, both Gonzalez and the author do believe that the workers were pretty involved in creating actos, both the genre and the works themselves, it seems. At least that would be I don't think that there would be that distinction. Either way, it was a collective effort is what they said. So what D is describing to me doesn't really sound like a collective effort on its face. But then again, there isn't something that specific that I could see as a stretch, distortion, or mischaracterization because I just didn't read enough. But still, I have to acknowledge that I can't identify anything that specific. So arguably, what D is describing is also collective effort. It's just that Valdez kind of makes the stuff and that people just kind of run off with it and do their own thing. Maybe that arguably is a collective effort in just its own way, but my sense that I got from reading paragraph 3 was that no, it's a little bit more involved than that. The actual actos themselves were made by the people, so kind of living it and doing it on the bottom, performing it, and living the lives whose experiences form the basis of it. That seems to be what was going on, not just some hoity-toity artists just kind of trickling their work down upon the unwashed masses who then run off and do their own thing with it. That doesn't sound like what was characterized to me. So I'm pretty happy to eliminate D at this point. So finally, pushing into E, by the early 70s, Valdez was using actos as the basis for other theatrical endeavors and was no longer directly associated with the Teatro Campesino. So honestly, this just strikes me as quite odd. I don't recall any discussion that could lead to the passage discussing Valdez's departure from Teatro Campesino, and not only that, him taking actos basically elsewhere and doing something else with it. I mean, I feel like Valdez moving on to other things would be a big enough occurrence that it would make itself known in the little that I did read, maybe as an aside in the end of the paragraph 1 or paragraph 2. I feel like they could have tucked it somewhere in there. But I do have to admit to myself that I could easily have missed this because I hate the passage and haven't read most of it, so maybe it's not in the places that I expected to see it, but was buried somewhere in the middle. I have to admit that that's possible. But that's just merely a possibility. I still feel like that wouldn't have been a logical thing for them to do, have something so significant not be discussed anywhere, so my gut feeling is to eliminate it. In fact, I mean, I'm just right back where I was at question 18. I've gotten rid of all 5, so I need to start right over again with A. See if I can uneliminate just one, hopefully. So going back to A, I'm going to look back at paragraph 3 real quick. Again, I've already reread this for question 18, so it's kind of in my mind, even though I'm losing some of the memory. I don't see any indication that anyone other than Gonzalez and the author cared about Carpas. There's no wider discussion about this being a widely discussed thing, so I'm going to eliminate A again. No real basis for it, no stretch. So answer choice B, uneliminating things. I'm going to have to uneliminate this one. I had to look around a little bit because I don't recall this subject being in paragraph 3. That's the only real thing that I read. Paragraph 1, of course, was the introduction of the link between political activism and the theater movement, so I didn't think that was there either. So I was stuck reading paragraph 2, and I did find this subject matter in paragraph 2. So, yeah, it's a huge stretch to me to say that it was a prominent feature, but at least comedy was a feature. C remains eliminated. Based on the research that I did for B just now, plus what I read of paragraph 3 for question 18 and for answer choice A, there was absolutely nothing there about Valdez wanting to replicate Campos in any way, shape, or form. Campos was just mentioned in the last paragraph of the passage, and there was never any indication that he wanted to recreate this in any form. So C is a pretty strong real elimination. So D, again, I had a little bit of trouble with this one, but ultimately I did re-eliminate it. I Had to find where it was first of all. I wasn't in. By this point, I've read about half the passage now in completion. I've read the latter half of paragraph 2 to do research on answer choice C. I've read paragraph 3 basically real quick, maybe 2 or 3 times at this point. Once for question 18, once again for answer choice A, and then again kind of reiterating for answer choice C. Now I'm adding the rest of paragraph 2. I had to read a little bit more of it for D here, but it was what I read was that it was more like Valdez was dramaizing, not dramatizing, but turning the workers' improv into more formal drama, or at least something written down or transmissible. And it wasn't the reverse, which is what D was suggesting. D is suggesting that the workers were taking what Valdez had already written and somehow modifying it. But that seems to be the reverse of the process that was described, and so my hunch was right. It seems like my hunch was right. It seems like it was the workers kind of doing the improv and then Valdez kind of giving that a more formalized format, not the other way around. So I re-eliminate this one. So moving along to our second round of E. This one was also another second elimination. Nothing about this in any one of paragraph 2 or paragraph 3 things that I read indicated that Valdez left the movement, and a quick scan of paragraph 1 confirms the same. There's just no discussion of this, and so my hunch again was right. I didn't think that the passage would have skipped over something so significant. And hopefully even on my second rereadings, just because they were all quick, I didn't miss it and I'm not making a fool of myself. But I don't see any basis for this anywhere. So in some ways, mercifully, even though it's a terrible answer, B is the only one that has been uneliminated at this point. And so before I move on, I do want to emphasize, I guess the hard part is when I deal with situations where I don't have the information that I need to answer. Generally speaking, I do find myself in this all 5 elimination points here, or all 5 elimination scenario. And the only way out of it does involve me rereading, and it's just kind of a stroke of luck, or you could say it was actually a stroke of good design, that I read for structure, and so I have a pretty good idea of if I want to find a detail about this particular answer, I know where to look. And it's not because I have some magical power or that I'm pre-recording this. This is essentially my unvarnished, authentic experience of doing this question. Don't be afraid that I have some magical research power that you do not. Without exception, I'm almost 100% sure without a single exception, those of you who care enough to watch this are better readers than I am when it comes to RC passages. It's not that I'm not a good reader, I just don't read RC. I just don't, so I cannot possibly be good at it because I don't do it. So the fact that you are most likely reading it for the most part, and succeeding on remembering details where I begin to forget the few that I even did read. You should be able to kind of do this as quickly as I can in terms of finding the places where to go and reread. That's usually not the problem with you guys. It's where to go and where to reread, but you don't know how to make the assessments that change your judgment, how to eliminate one thing the first pass and then end up uneliminating the second time around. My standard hasn't really changed between the first elimination and the second unelimination for B. So we'll discuss actually how I got to that point without spending too much more time on this slide. In some respects, to me, B is still a massive stretch and arguably even worse than C from 18. I mean, sure, I can see that the comic statement becomes the basis for the rest of the Octo that satirizes the issue. So in that sense, arguably, comedy is at least foundational to Octos. It's kind of where the whole thing springs from. But I mean, get out of here. If the author wanted to express how prominent comedy was to Octos, they sure did the worst possible job of doing so. And this is not just me being, mean to reading copy, even though I would be mean to reading copy even if it wasn't poorly written. But just look at how this is written. This is me being like writer James now. Every time comedy is brought up, it is subordinated in purpose to something political. The initial comic statement, for instance, that's supposed to demonstrate a problem or an issue, not be funny. It's supposed to do something else. That's why it's important. And the satirical nature of Octos is mentioned almost in passing as a part of something that all good political theater is supposed to do. So it's not even the satire seems that important. It's just like, satire, because that's what political theater does. That's how it was presented. And if that weren't bad enough, if it weren't bad enough that they mention, the comic statement only to immediately subordinate it to some political purpose, i.e. demonstrating a social problem, and then they bring up the satirical nature only again to dismiss it and subordinate it as part of what good political theater is supposed to do. They finally cap it off by telling us that ultimately the whole purpose of an Octos, all that stuff, all that humor, I guess, to what little extent it did occur, all of that serves to inspire the audience to action, not entertain them, not make them laugh. There's no comedy there. This is all some propagandistic purpose, really, is what they're saying. And so that's what they say about comedy. It's at every single possible way. They express comedy as secondary to some other political purpose. And some answer choice explanation out there is going to sit there and tell me that I should not consider this a massive stretch. This is barely defensible. This is only correct because nothing else was less incorrect. That's it. This is only correct because everything else was so much more wrong. That's it. This is not defensible whatsoever. And so remember, answer choice B is trying to pretend as if comedy mattered to this genre. I mean, but what we just saw is that none of what was written about comedy in the context of Chicano theater, none of it actually emphasizes the role of comedy as being important. If anything, the only mentions that we get are consistently diminishing it. So against the backdrop of that, no one can convince me that B is actually a good answer. So here's the real kicker. Despite its imperfection, despite my actual hatred of it, I did see it as the one possible correct answer on second pass. That's what matters. It doesn't matter that I thought it was still a terrible answer. Why did I end up picking it? So just to review again real quickly, A, there was just no stretch point to reach the widely discussed aspect of it, or the US and Mexican theater scholars. But yeah, there are too many stretch points and not enough places to reach them. B at least does give us a stretch point to work from. Again, they do mention comedy at least. It's not non-existent. And it does have a foundational role, but like I said, it's written in the most absolutely diminishing form possible, but it's there. And unfortunately for C, compared to B, there is just no stretch point in terms of reaching the great lengths to simulate or recreate compos. That's just something that does not exist in the passage. Comedy at least exists in the passage, but, Valdez's efforts to recreate compos, there's just nothing there. Just nothing there. Now, D is a little tricky. This issue is discussed, but the answer is factually incorrect. If you recall, we were able to see that it wasn't that Valdez wrote something and then the farm actors kind of did their own thing with it. It was kind of the reverse. The farm actors were doing their thing and Valdez was the one recording it, in a sense. And E is just flat out wrong. The passage simply never touches on Valdez's supposed departure. At least if it did, I never saw it, but that's my position and I'm sticking with it. It's just wrong. So I just want to emphasize here, I didn't actually have to change my mind about my dislike of B. And again, I also want to make sure that I emphasize before I move on, the way I handle details that I don't have is that once I realize that my lack of detail is leaving me in a position where I can't pick an answer, I do go back and research everything. But of course that only happens because I do it fast enough and I'm used to it. But yeah, you do have to research things. But then again, that should be nothing new to you. You guys are researching things anyway. So it's not like that's a real point of difference. But the real essence here is I want you to observe that I did not change my mind about B. I did not change my mind about B. I still thought it was bad. I just acknowledged that at least a stretch point existed, that it did acknowledge comedy. C, there was just simply nothing. D, it was there, but it was factually incorrect. E, there was nothing. A, there was nothing. And so at that point, it became obvious to me that B, as little of an anchor as it did have to the link between comedy and the centrality of comedy to Chicano theater, the others just simply had less. They either had none or they were just factually incorrect. There was no way to stretch any of the answer choices to fit into the passage compared to B, where, I mean, it's still a terrible fit, but there's a place to kind of latch your hook onto. You can, it's like, okay, they do talk about comedy, and they do say it is the basis of Octos, even though they say it in the most diminishing possible way. They do say it. I don't have to change my opinion of B. I just have to recognize that B, as it is still less inferior than A, C, D, and E. And so I am going to kind of begin to wrap it up here because of the runtime is already long enough, I think. So what do I want you guys to learn from all of this? The first thing is beware of irrelevance. So if the answer mentions X, but the passage doesn't even have a stretch point to reach X, then that's a nobody said this or irrelevant answer. Such answers are generally inferior to stretch answers. Speaking of stretch answers, please beware of stretches. If both the answer and the passage treat a concept X in the same general manner, but the answer qualifies concept X and maybe pushes it a bit harder in that same direction. So what I mean by that is, by example, if the passage says X is connected to Y, but the answer says X is significant to Y, You can see that significant is kind of just an upgrade from X being connected to Y, but it's not contrary to how the passage says it, right? The passage says that there's sort of a positive thing. These two things are connected, and the answer isn't denying that, isn't saying that no, X and Y are disconnected. It's kind of agreeing with the passage, but just even pushing it further in that same direction. Then that, my friends, is a stretch. Then the answer is a stretch. It might be correct, but be hesitant to fully endorse it. You will rarely, if ever, be stuck between two stretches. If you are, feel free to email me about the scenario. If I find the examples that you give me compelling enough, it may even make it into another video. But for the most part, from what I've seen, very rarely do students actually end up stuck between two stretches where you've got one stretch here and one stretch there, and you're comparing stretch against stretch, and one of them's right and one of them's a trap. That tends to be not the case. Usually, if you're being consistent with the standards that you're applying, you will end up uneliminating a stretch. And everything else is not really going to be a stretch in the same objective manner. It's either going to be irrelevant, or it's going to be missing something, or it's going to be just factually incorrect. It's one of those things. The stretch concept, generally speaking, is not pitted against itself. And so not everybody does this, and I don't expect everybody to do so because it's not that efficient for most people. But if you do eliminate all five and you go back for a second pass, treat stretches more favorably than irrelevant ones, and obviously more favorable than factually incorrect ones, but that goes without saying. So there's another important question that I've kind of alluded to several times, but I do want to get into a little bit more specifically again here before you guys go. Why is it okay to have stretch and irrelevant, have those concepts become so personal and non-objective? And it's because rather than trying to change your minds about when to doubt an answer choice or when to embrace one, I've found that over the years I've had much more success teaching people how to deal with your current set of doubts. That's what this is all about. So again, I really didn't like answer choice C from 18, and I did not like answer choice B from 18. Note, in all of my reasoning, I never changed the fact that I didn't like it. I didn't have to change my dislike of it. I didn't have to change my objections to it. I just had to be subjectively ready to just kind of open my eyes and see that when I look at answer choice B for question number 20, I do see that it has a concept of comedy being central, and that the passage, in some really, really poor, thin, stretched out way, has at least a place for that comedy concept to link up to with the answer choice. So the comedy as described in the answer choice, despite how terrible it is, I think, it does link up to some aspect, no matter how weak it is. There is some way that you can say comedy was at least supposed to have been central to Octos. There was some opportunity for that. It doesn't make B any better as an answer choice. It's just that as it is, I didn't have to change B to understand that okay, it's not good, but at least comedy here and comedy there, and they weren't inconsistent with each other. Everything else, A, C, D, and E, was in some way either non-existent. There was no sort of linkage point that I could do as I did for answer choice B, or it was just like answer choice E, just flat out factually incorrect. And D, in some sense, was also factually incorrect in that it was kind of a distortion. It changed the relationship between the farm workers and Valdez in a way that sounded plausible until you actually went back and looked at it. So yeah, again, this is subjective because it's okay to feel something is wrong for whatever reason you want to. And I'm kind of preaching the choir here because I know that most of you who are here you have some valid basis for not liking a stretch answer, because it is a stretch. You detect that. But for me to sit here and pretend like I have some objective standard to describe to you that is always going to work, that to me, I've tried that for, I'd say, maybe the first 6 years of my teaching career. It just didn't work. Even though I already knew better than to try it, I still stuck with it because that was the only thing I knew how to do. And it didn't work. And so over time, as I kind of reflected on how I personally did stuff, I was able to realize that actually, hey, I am not really changing my mind about answer choices that I don't like. I am simply giving it a second pass and looking at it differently, such that I can still dislike it, but I am able to objectively recognize things that the answer choice contains that allows it to be a stretch answer. I'm not changing. I thought it was a stretch to begin with. I still think it's a stretch now, but at least the stretch is possible. And I was able to recognize in all the other answer choices that I eliminated that the stretch was either non-existent or impossible or just factually wrong. There was something else, not the stretch. So that's the whole key here, guys. And so again, thanks for watching to the end. Like and subscribe, do all that stuff. I spent many precious minutes of runtime kind of ranting and repeating at the end, but it's important enough that I'll repeat it again here. You do not have to change your mind about what you don't like about an answer choice. The whole goal on second pass is to be more accurate in describing what it is that you don't like about the answer. What exactly is the stretchiness of that answer? And if you could recognize that there is at least one way for that stretch to connect to the passage, that may save that answer, and that may save that question for you. Because if you know that one answer choice has a stretch, you can probably find that the others don't have a similar stretch, and that will get you the right answer even if you didn't like it. So again, that's like the 8th time I've said it, and I keep wanting to say it because I just don't know if it's clear enough. This is a concept that I struggle teaching my live students as well. So if you still have questions, feel free to email me and I will get back to you. I'd love to set up a conversation in the context of a question where you feel like, hey James, I tried this stretch thing and I really don't feel like it's helping. Talk to me and we'll see if we can figure something out for you.